And I was
I grew up in a hunting family. Ditto, and they just disappeared, all of us.
You're alive.
Welcome back, folks. This is the Joint Justice Oversight Committee. I was going to say another committee that I was just saying.
Hold on. I just got this thing where
We're not on.
it says like.
Do we time out?
Let's just go with it. It says live.
My video's off, but I'm here.
You're here, Dick. I don't think we're live yet. I don't know. Is there an issue?
You're live.
You are, can you see us? Well, you're on Zoom.
Yeah, we're
I can see
We're
it.
good? Okay. Well, I'm going to start over. This is Joint Legislative Justice Oversight Committee. We're in the afternoon. I don't know if we can just get started. We're going to hear from law enforcement as well as state's attorneys and an advocate in terms of the Office of Child, Youth, and Family. I would assume we would start out with Lieutenant, well, I have Captain Sean Lowe, Lieutenant, and I see Sean is on Zoom. And we have also John Campbell here with the Department of State's Attorneys, Sheriffs, and Matthew Bernstein. They're here in the room. Okay. Well, let's start with the lieutenant from the Vermont State Police. I think, Dick, you're the one that worked on setting up the agenda. Is the thinking here to see what law enforcement and the courts are seeing in terms of juveniles coming through the judiciary system? And
And how my main goal was to look at how the lack of secure placement facility is impacting law enforcement, our legal system, as well as the youth and family advocate. That was a suggestion from, I think, Senator Lyons, to hear from Matthew as well. But, that's the goal, is to try to understand what's the impact beyond DCF. We heard this morning from DCF workers about how it's impacting them, but how's it impacting others in the juvenile justice system?
yeah, great. So, Lieutenant, why don't we start with you and then we'll go down the list on the agenda. So welcome. And if you could just identify yourself for the record too.
Of course. Good afternoon. My name is Sean Lone. I'm a captain with the Vermont State Police. I'm the Special Investigations Commander. So within my command is the Vermont Intelligence Center, the Narcotics Enforcement Unit, and the Fire and Explosions Unit. What I hope to bring today was some data regarding several points here. Juvenile offenders, crime offenders, violent crime as it pertains to both juveniles as victims and offenders, opioid overdoses for juveniles, gun violence specifically with juveniles, and then just the overall nature and where we're headed trend-wise with juvenile crime. And I have some examples at the end if people would like some other examples, but I thought that would be a good starting point to get a lay of the land, essentially.
Do you have any documents that you have sent at all, or is this just?
No, ma'am. I'm working from some law enforcement sensitive material, and what I was hoping to do is speak to the stuff that was public. And
okay.
At the end, if it works well, what we'll do is we'll put together a product and we'll push it to the group.
Okay, great.
Yep. So I just wanted to start out with the overall trend, like a 5-year trend for victims and offenders as juveniles. So, when we look at offenders from 10 to 19 years old of crimes, this is using what they call uniform crime reporting, is what the FBI reports on nationwide. We consistently have, from that offender 10 to 19, about the same percentage of our overall crime. Actually, it went down almost a full percentage point from 2017 till now. But because our overall crime has gone up, 2017, we had 162 of our crimes were committed by offenders 10 to 19. This year it was 201, or last year, I'm sorry. So the percentage of it stays the same, but the numbers are increasing. The interesting part though with this data is that the change in juveniles as victims. So in 2017, juveniles they accounted for 20% of the victims in the state of Vermont, victims of crime, which is about 219 juveniles. But in 2022, they accounted for 26%. That 6% increase is the increase of total number of victims. So the number went up quite large. It's 376. We had 376 crime victims in Vermont between 10 and 19 years old last year. So as our numbers are increasing, juveniles as both victims, specifically as offenders, they tend to take up the same amount percentage-wise of our crime, but the number is growing because the overall number is growing. But as victims, they actually increased in 2022. We're interested to see where that goes in 2023, especially with the increase in violence we've seen. Another thing is looking at violent crime offenders and victims. You know, juvenile involvement in violent crime in Vermont was trending downward until about 2021. And between 21 and 22, the percentage of violent crime involving juvenile offenders, that 10 to 21 range, and victims, 10 to 21, has increased. And we'll talk later about gun violence data and how it's particular to juveniles, specifically gun violence. So one of the things that the VIC does, the Vermont Intelligence Center, we're a fusion center, we manage the drug monitoring initiative. So what that is it is a law enforcement-based look at the opioid epidemic, but specifically opioid overdoses when law enforcement would respond to it. So the reason why I mention that is when we look at Department of Health data, they're looking at visits to the emergency room or ambulance visits, you know, involvements. But what we're looking at is when a police officer goes to a scene of an overdose, fatal or non-fatal. So when we collect this information, we only use people that intentionally ingested substances. So we're not looking at infants and toddlers. What we're looking at is people that actually used opioids and then overdosed. So our numbers are actually trending down, which is great to see. We generally expect with the increase in overdoses to see a significant increase with juveniles. So right near, you know, these numbers are partially vetted. We wait for OCME data, but we try to react to them as quickly as possible and not wait, you know, the 3 to 6 months to get better data. In 2022, the total year we had 1 fatal and 10 non-fatal for 18 and under, and 11. So a total of 11 for the year. This year we have 1 fatal and 3 non-fatal through about mid-September, which is that's great. That's a reduction in overdoses in the 18 and under class that are being handled by law enforcement. There was no significant changes after 2020, even though what we're seeing in fatal overdoses, I mean, we're on schedule this year to be up 150% from 2019 in fatal overdoses in Vermont. This is an enormous, essentially it's a killer in Vermont. A lot of people are dying from opioid overdoses. But what we are seeing in juveniles is that under 18 range is trending downward, which is a nice thing to see. Another thing I wanted to talk about with gun violence. So homicides and gunshot wounds is how we look at gun violence. 2022, the percentage of offenders 18 and under in our data collection was 0. We had 5 offenders from 19 to 21 years old. About 16% of our gun violence in 2022 was committed by people that were 19 to 21 years old. In the victim class, so 18s and under for victims, we had 3 victims, which accounted for about 7% of our numbers. And then for 19 to 21-year-olds in 2022, we had 3 victims. In 2023, we saw an increase in offenders. So we've had through mid-September 2 offenders, so people that were using the firearm and either killed someone or shot someone. So there was 2 total of 18 and under, and then there was 2 19 to 21. Our victims went down. We had only 1 victim under the age of 18 and only 1 victim from 19 to 21. This is through September. There's been a lot of things that have happened in October, and we don't have all the data for that yet. So we began maintaining gun violence in 2022. So there is a limited, we can't go back 5 years like we could in other places. But what we are seeing is that gun violence is continuing to trend upward, not as sharp of an increase as it was from 2021 to 2022. But with the juvenile offenders, we're seeing an increase in that under 18 and 19 to 21 offender status. So we're seeing that juveniles are using firearms in crimes more often than they were in previous years. Next section I wanted to talk about was we used the National Institute of Justice, the National Gang Center, to define what is considered an organized gang. So 3 or more members aged 12 to 24 share an identity, a name, symbols. They view themselves as a gang. That's how they describe themselves. And they also separate themselves from other gangs. There's an automatic kind of conflict with other groups. And they have to be involved in an elevated level of criminal activity. Over the past 2 years, we've seen 2 youth gangs in Chittenden County that have several members. They share colors, red and blue symbols, use hand signs, emojis in social media. They recognize each other as members. They recognize other groups as members of other gangs. But what's interesting is over the past 2 years, we've seen these groups as a whole increase in their law enforcement contacts, both in violent crime and in property crime. As an example, we had one person, 14-year-old male, 117 involvements with law enforcement, and 22 of them within 24 days. Was caught with a firearm, 14, caught with fentanyl. We're seeing these behaviors increase in this age range, and not only just increase, but become repetitive. So we're seeing juveniles that before their 18th birthday have 70 involvements with police, and they're increasing from initial threats or fights at school to possession of a firearm or a stolen firearm or stealing a vehicle or fighting with police or even shootings. So this is something that we've been tracking, and what we're trying to do is collect more data over time, look at demographics, look at socioeconomic things, and try to figure out what's driving this juvenile trend with violent crime. It's great to see the opioid use go down, the overdoses, at least from the law enforcement perspective, but the increase in violent crime is concerning. So that it's a very brief, but I wanted to bring some of those numbers, and what I can do is I can create a non-law enforcement copy with some of those numbers that we could give to the group for reference.
So Lieutenant, that would be very, very helpful if you could collate that and send it to us. If you could send that to Peggy Delaney,
Yep.
That would be terrific. So some of the data that you have presented, is that what has come through all law enforcement in the state, or is that what's just come through the state police?
So the universal crime reporting, which is the first set of data, which just talks about juveniles involved in crime in general, that's actually from the FBI. So that collects all the statewide law enforcement through like it's uniform crime report, UCR data. When we talk about overdoses, opioid overdoses, and we talk about gun violence, the Vermont Intelligence Center actually uses the RMS system to collect data. There are 3 agencies, police agencies, on a different RMS system. So we get all but 3 police agencies. And those 3 police agencies are in the Springfield, Hartford area.
Okay.
So it is statewide. It's not just Vermont State Police.
Yeah, that's helpful. So we do have a question here. It's on Zoom. Topper.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Is the reason for the death by overdose, is that because of the availability of Narcan?
That's a difficult question to answer. What I will say is the introduction of chemicals like xylazine, which don't allow naloxone or Narcan to work, has caused an increase statewide in our overdose deaths, because our fatalities have risen like I mentioned, from 2019 till now, 152%. From 21 to 22, it was almost 100%. That increase in overdose fatalities throughout the state is not being seen in the juveniles. So I wouldn't lean that it was Narcan based. I would love to think that it's because they're using less or not taking the risks. But what we would say is that if the numbers are increasing statewide, the juveniles should be continuing with that. You know, like if we're seeing that 100% increase, we would think we'd see 100% more juvenile fatalities. We're not. It's actually going down just a percentage point or two, but it is trending downward. Does that answer your question, sir?
Yes, yes. Thank you.
Yes.
Any other questions? I think we've got the after lunch sag. Yes, well, thank you, Lieutenant. And if you could send those numbers to Peggy, that would be great.
Yes, ma'am. We'll have that sent to you soon.
Okay.
Thank
Thank you. So let's shift now to John Campbell, who's in the Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs. Welcome.
Good morning, Madam Chair.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, right, I'm sorry. You know what it is that I've been watching all morning, and I saw that, I think it was Ms. Casanova that was testifying from, and she had that beautiful background. Thing, I want to be there.
That's the way it's come in and the palm trees.
Yeah, exactly. You know, I'll tell you, actually, first of all, John Campbell, Executive Director of the State's Attorneys and Sheriffs. And thank you for letting me be here. But going back to actually her testimony, I think she said it all. I mean, this is a problem that its acuity cannot be understated at all. You know, we have, aside from just our state's attorneys or deputies or the state's attorneys themselves, we of course deal with a lot of the DCF workers on a regular basis. And I can tell you, from the stories I hear, the morale of these folks, they're doing jobs that they never signed up for, they never were trained for. They're getting exposed to very dangerous situations. And, you know, I think we're fortunate that we still have the number of people working in social services that we do. It's extremely scary. Some of again, I know that they mentioned, Steve Howard mentioned a couple of incidents, but I think that there have been far more of those. And when I think he said we dodged the bullet, we've been dodging those, but you can only do that for so long. So, and the other thing too is that, you know, we've been talking about this problem for a long time. It's not something that's new, you know, the need for the secure facility. And if we continue just to talk about it and then just keep on kicking the can down the road, I sincerely, or I can't tell you again, I understate how worried that I would be that something is going to happen. We are going to have a tragedy occur. And I don't think that when we look back on it and say, well, how did that happen? Which is what always occurs. You know, we all have to take responsibility. And so I know that the department, DCF, they're trying to get things moving along as fast as possible, but there's not enough speed to do it. And I think this is something where, again, in past legislation, when we get into issues, we see the issue, we want to put that first immediate Band-Aid on it, and then you move on to something else. Or you turn the problem over to somebody who you think is going to follow up and do their, you know, what they're supposed to do. Unfortunately, is oftentimes that there are many things on their plates and some things just don't get done or they get pushed to the back. This is one where I just hope that the commissioner of DCF, from which Chris Winters is great in person, and I feel I have a lot of confidence, tremendous confidence in him, but somebody has got to have their finger on whoever's doing this and planning and moving it to get it done, and that's a priority, nothing else. Otherwise, you're going to face that situation where either we will not have social workers because they're not going to want to get into the work, or you're going to have one that has been seriously injured or dead. And I don't think anyone here or anyone in the state would want to see that happen. now get off my soapbox on that. As far as with the state's attorneys, we're seeing now is that there are more, when the lieutenant mentioned the gangs, there are more gang activity, not just local gangs here, but ones from Massachusetts and from Connecticut, and also down from New Jersey. And we're finding that a lot of them are utilizing and using youth to go and commit the crimes. We found, and this is public knowledge, that actually one of the phones that was acquired during a homicide investigation, it was turned out that the person was Googling, the Vermont raised the age law and homicide and what they could be charged with, what they couldn't be charged with. So the use of more people and the level of violence and I guess more even the aggressiveness of some of these youth, some of the people that we're encountering, it just seems to be escalating far above. I think far above data actually said. I know the lieutenant had mentioned about the data going down, and now it's on the rise. But we see things more on a day-to-day basis where that something may not be charged, but we know about it. We know something has happened. We know that somebody's been threatened with guns, and we know that it's an individual, a youth, but you can't charge them because we don't have. We're not ready at that point to make the charges. So a lot of that is anecdotal, but I can tell you, having spoken to one of the law enforcement, I just left, I spoke with a group of law enforcement officers in Southern Vermont, and they're as frustrated as everyone is. And so I think if there's any messages that this should have been done yesterday, and we should not even be here talking about this. So I just hope, and I know that you, Madam Chair, and the committee and Senator Sears are committed to having this happen. I just hope that somebody doesn't take their eye off the ball.
So what would you recommend in terms of what your folks, your state's attorneys and your sheriffs, and by extension, other law enforcement are seeing out there in terms of the activity that's being done by juveniles? And we don't have any placement for them. And going forward and building a permanent system of care to them in a facility that's a building facility or multiple. What programming would you encourage us to? Would it be different? I mean, there's a lot of drug use, violence. How would we be tailoring our programming to address what you're seeing?
Well, I think you have different populations of the youth that we're talking about. You have those who have mental health issues, and those are ones that clearly I don't have the expertise to testify about, but there's different treatment process for those. I mean, the article that you read about what happened at Woodside, you can't make that stuff up. And so whatever facility or program you have has to be brought in. We'd have to have that core group that really have the expertise in that area. You don't need prison guards doing this. You need doctors. You need psychiatrists, psychologists, therapists. They're the ones that should be deciding on what policy and what's the best process for it. Then you're dealing with the violent or the aggressive the person who's unwilling to accept any consequences or believes that there are not going to be consequences, which I'll be frank, that is one of the biggest problems we're facing is that the kids on the street right now, they laugh every day they go to court because of the fact that they know that nothing's going to happen and that they're going to be released right back on the street. I'm not getting into it's not involving a bail argument or anything of that nature. It's just the fact that they know that they're not going to be held responsible. So therefore, they're without any accountability. It's like the Old West. And so you've got a combination of drug abuse, substance abuse issues that also you'd have to find some way to deal with that. But then there's that part where somebody's got to bring accountability back onto the table and to the discussion. I mean, again, we're all looking to have a fair and equitable system, but you can't just continuously tell somebody who's been arrested, dozens and dozens and dozens of times and does not take any type of responsibility for their actions. And you're facing the victims of these crimes. You just, in my opinion, you just can't continue like that. There has to be some accountability.
We have a lot more questions. Jenny, Martin, and Teresa.
Thank you, and thanks for your work. And I think that I've asked this question in the past, but certainly different states' attorneys have different perspectives on when to prosecute, when not to prosecute, when how to hold over.
We know that we're talking about kids and folks who have illnesses, whether it's an addiction or mental health issues, but
So from your perspective and from where you sit, what are you doing or what can be done to build a consistent framework?
so that when a state's attorney sees a specific issue, that there's some way that they're dealing with the individual the same way. I mean, because we see and I know they're all elected and, it's different across the state, but is there something that we can do to build some common criteria or for decision-making?
Yeah, I think that there's kind of maybe a misunderstanding exactly how it's done. There's the disparity issue has been brought up by many people, and it's said that there are 12 or 14 different forms of justice in the state. The one thing that has to first be understood is that when there's a decision, when these things come in, it's not just made by the state's attorney. You also have a defense attorney and you have a judge as to what happens and what is done with the individual coming before them. But the actual decision to charge, and yes, there are some of our state's attorneys who may not charge, let's say, a retail theft. But they do over in another jurisdiction. And a lot of that comes because the constituency within that county expects certain things to happen and expects other things not to happen. So I think that we look at the differences they're not as drastic as far as numbers of like disparity. I would say there's maybe disparity between some of the charging decisions in 1 or 2 or 3 of the counties, but for the most part, the rest of the counties are similar. But then if you go into that next stage of after the charge, and then when it gets to the arraignment then there's a difference. But there's also, quite frankly, there's a differences in resources, because you get one county who might, let's say, not decide not to charge a crime. Well, that state's attorney may know that they can send this individual to they have a resource that they can send her, like one of their CJCs or something that can help maybe try to change the behavior there. Whereas in another county, they don't have that opportunity. That's why, with CJCs, some alternative justice programs, they're great in some counties and very strong, but in others, they still have the resources. So you're right in your observation. It's just that there's I think if you try to change the discretion and alter the discretion that a prosecutor has, you're going to, I think, could possibly do more damage than assist in situations where you're trying to get that parity, because there are alternatives that have to be taken into consideration. And then finally, the last thing is that one of the biggest problems we have is the fact that the number of cases that each individual person has. Now, it's not just the work side, it's just the ability for the state's attorney to be able to actually, or deputy, to actually work with the defendant and say, okay, is there something out in their community? Is there some way to turn this person around to, where they understand? And so without that ability, and it's not just us, it's also the defense bar and the judiciary. We don't have, there's too many cases going through to have the opportunity to really deal with people the way we used to. here. And I think that has a lot to do with what we're saying.
So when the gaps are being identified, how are they sort of reported? Is there a place where we identify all those needs within the system? So if you've got someone who could use some community support, does that information get somewhere? Obviously, this is a question.
Yeah, we've raised these concerns. This is nothing new. We've raised the concerns. It's just like the same thing with, DOC now, making a decision not to have work crew any longer. And not coming up with what I consider to be a reasonable alternative. It takes something away. And when I think almost every time that I've testified, I always testify about, resources, local resources and the lack thereof. And then there's some organizations that are the ones that are kind of like the magnets for all the federal funds. And while they may get federal funds, it doesn't trickle down to some of the other little, parts of the state where it could really do a lot of good. It's generally centralized in Chittenden County and, it's somewhat less so in some of the other counties. Sorry about Chittenden County. I didn't want to totally knock it, but it is the largest county.
So I want to ask a broader question, but before I have you answer that, I'm going to ask you a narrow question. So accountability, I wanted to dig down a little bit on this, on where the problem is. And I just heard you answering Senator Lyons' question that certainly resources seem to be part of it. You mentioned state's attorney defenders. I would add courts probably to that as well, because you're not able to process these cases very fast. But I did have a broader question as far as whether the fact of somebody being treated in the juvenile justice rather than the criminal justice is where you're getting at the accountability. But before you answer that, because I want to ask the chair if we're allowed to go down that road, I will ask you the narrower question first. Does the lack of the juvenile facilities affect accountability?
My opinion, yes, it absolutely.
Okay, if you could explain that, since that, I guess, the purpose of
That's
this
what the question.
hearing.
Yeah.
And we can deal with that other one some other days. Right. So,
Yeah, it's not,
You and Senator Sears.
so I want that down.
and this is not knocking that raise the age. I mean, there's some good, rationale for it. And it's just the question of, which individuals are going to be affected positively by it and which ones aren't. And one of the other parts for your firmer question is that it's interesting and this is another, what I consider exacerbates the problem, is the timing in which there is some type of justice, or if the time before the person gets to that day where it's, let's say, their trial. So if you arrest somebody, especially in drug or substance abuse issues, and you arrest them and they have to go into treatment right away. If they know they have to go to treatment right away because they're going to be facing a expedited hearing for whatever's going to, eventually occur with them, they're going to go in and get that treatment. Whereas if they come in, they get arrested for possession and use of drugs, and they know that they're not going to have to show up again in court for 90, 180 days, maybe even longer, before they have that some decision is made about what's going to happen to them, then they're going to go back right to their lifestyle and say, well, I've got a little brief time here, so I might as well sit there and have some fun or do whatever I shouldn't say it's fun, but they're not going to, I think, take it as seriously until that hammer is coming a little closer to coming down.
So that's the immediacy of the consequences.
Yes.
But I guess the question still is, how about the availability of detention facility? How does that affect the actual amount of time you're seeing by juveniles?
Well, we often find it. In fact, I talked to two other state's attorneys who called me about this exact same problem. last week where that, and it's funny because I was reading back on some of the previous articles about this issue and somebody complained back then and our state's attorneys were getting calls like 2 or 3 on certain cases. I can't go into the specifics of it, but there was no place to put the juveniles. And they're calling all around saying, look, we got to put fines someplace. And they couldn't. And that person was just released back to their home. And in a couple of situations, probably was not the best idea.
So, thank you.
Teresa and then Senator Sears.
Senator Lyons pretty much asked the question that I was going to ask, but I guess one of the things that I think is difficult in a state this size, it's a little hard to really swallow sort of that, that there's, appears to be, I'm not going to say it's borne out in fact, but appears to be, such differences in, prosecutorial discretion used. And, it feels like there isn't, that, somebody facing a situation like that, if they're in one county versus another county in a state as small as Vermont, doesn't seem as though there should be that much difference. And it seems that there are greater differences in it. And I heard what you said, that in most of the areas, it's pretty similar, but there are other areas where it's not. And I think those are the areas, honestly, that I hear about.
Right.
That my constituents complain to me about. And it doesn't make sense to me in a state the size of Vermont that there should be those kinds of differences.
And all I can say is that, with each individually elected state's attorney and really the only individuals they have to answer to are their constituents. Some believe that justice should be done in one fashion. There's more of a progressive feel, I guess, to how justice is obtained. And others there's not. And there's for the state's attorneys that may be more on the, let's say, progressive side, and I say with a little p, that there are people around the country and their organizations, and there's data that says that the way they are processing and their policies are correct policies for justice reform. There are, of course, you can find data to kind of say anything, but I can't fault the state's attorneys who believe that, and the communities that they represent. And I would, however, I think that what is finally being demonstrated is that while something may work in one area or one place, it may not work in others. And I think a lot of it, again, comes down to resources in the community, or resources that are available for the individuals. If you decide not to charge somebody because you feel that they can get assistance out in the community that might be able to change their behavior, if they do have those resources, that's great. And if they have the trained people to actually work with it. But if they don't exist, it's not going to work. So, and a lot of the program or a lot of policies that might be implemented here in Vermont are at a disadvantage because of the fact that we are totally different. We're a rural state, no matter what, we'd like to think. Sometimes this is still a rural state, and we don't have the finances or the money to fund the resources that are necessary, I think.
Senator Sears, stand up.
I'd like to thank you, John. I want to just say that Raise the Age has been exceptionally successful for about 95% of the kids who are involved in it. It's that 5% that we seem to focus on because they're the failures. And learned early on when I got into the career of corrections that, your successes never admit that they're in corrections, or they never admit they're in the juvenile justice system, but your failures stand out because everybody reads about them, everybody knows about them. So they stand out like a sore thumb. And I think sometimes we get to saying that something isn't working because the high profile case, Willie Horton came to mind from Michael Dukakis, for example, and what a sham that was, as if Massachusetts system was a complete failure for one individual. But going back to the issue of a lack of a high-end facility, I think I want to better understand how that impacts. You mentioned the decision to send somebody home because there wasn't a high-end facility available for them. And if they needed the high-end facility, sending them home only further traumatized the kid and the victims and anyone else. In my experience, many of these kids need something stabilization. And that's what a short-term program would do, is stabilize until you can find a more appropriate placement. And I'm wondering how the lack of that impacts your state's attorneys, impacts your decision making, and so forth. If we can come back to that, how does that impact the decision making and sending somebody who's probably not appropriate to be back in the community right away? It's not doing that individual child any favors, and it's certainly not doing the community any favors. How's that impact?
Well, if Senator, first, if I could just touch real quickly on the raise the age, I agree with you. I think that the raise the age is in fact, a lot of our people in Canada, they were working doing that even before, as far as how they dealt with some 18, 19-year-olds. I think it is a good program, and you're right. It's the people who, the high profile cases, which are obviously not the majority, that kind of people would point fingers at. But I think the legislation that was passed, we supported it then, we support it now. It's just that unfortunately there are some people who I think are probably not suited for it, and those are the ones that end up causing problems for the rest. As far as what effect does it have, I think it's hard to say that, because there are many cases where, and I can't give you the exact numbers, I was not prepared for that where our people would have asked for, or that law enforcement or DCF would have asked for secure placement. Without it, there's only a limited amount of beds, as we all know, in the state for certain places. And there are certain people that are not, don't meet the criteria. So outside the fact that the concern for us is, and the problems it creates for us, is that the individuals who don't have that immediate assistance, as you had stated, they are probably going to be seen again, time and time again before this gets done. So I guess the lack of the facility, or the lack of the programming, basically sets these kids up for failure. And when they fail, they become, right, they're in our arena. And so that's the major problem. But that, and our major concern, one of the other major concerns, is the fact of the safety of the DCF and the social workers that are dealing with them. So I apologize, Senator, because I don't think I can give you a direct answer other than that. It's based on.
And in setting the agenda, I didn't invite people who work in the residential field. I can only report that there are a number of assaults that never happened before on staff in those programs, because they're being asked to take kids that are probably not appropriate for their programs. And I know that frequently I'll read in the local paper about assaults on staff in various facilities.
Yes, and you know those do
And it's
occur.
not just, I just want to make clear, it's not just DCF workers who are coming under assault. We've had some fairly serious assault in some of the group homes.
The perfect example is, and I watched this video myself, probably about 5 months ago, of a youth who was actually down in your neck of the woods, who was at a facility, and he had his first schizophrenic episode. And it was the most frightening thing I've seen in a long time. This individual who was sitting here as normal as you and I, and then out of the blue, just punched one of the workers. And so you're right, it's not just, and then he also went on, they eventually took him to the hospital where he assaulted several of the nurses and techs there in another episode. And, you know, this poor young kid, he's like 16 years old, and evidently it turned out that his father, it was in his family as far as having schizophrenia, but this was just his initial episode. So, and it was very frightening. He was lucky that no one got hurt worse than a few bruises and bumps, but those things happen.
Any other questions? John?
Well, thank you very much. I do appreciate it. And as always, we're happy to help out in any way, shape, or form. And I just would ask the committee not to forget this conversation that everybody has had with you today. And I think it also would be interesting. I know that you received an invitation, again, from watching earlier, you received an invitation to go and see in the field, to spend some time there. I think it would really be advantageous to see who we're dealing with and who DCF and social services, and not just them, but also nurses and hospitals and everything else that they're having to use. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Happy Bernstein, welcome. Director of the Office of Child, Youth and Family Advocate. Thank you, Jerry.
Yeah.
And I know that you have the document.
We have. Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. And I have with me Lauren Higby. Sorry, I'll introduce myself. I'm Matthew Bernstein. I am the Child, Youth and Family Advocate for the state of Vermont. And I have with me
Lauren Higby, Deputy Advocate.
For those that don't know, we're a new office. We just started operation this year. Many folks in this room were responsible in bringing about our office, and it was a many-year effort. And we think this is our moment among many. We think we are well positioned to bring some insight to this issue. Before I go further, I just want to thank the DCF workers, Tracy Casanova, and all of the workers. Yesterday, we were down in the southern part of the state. I was sitting with a kid who was being staffed, and I talked to the workers there. I talked to the young person as well. There was a 3-on-1. I might have been mentioned earlier. There was a nurse in the room as well. And I want to bring some insight to that in a moment. But it's quite clear that folks on the front line care an immense amount and are putting their safety on the line to keep kids safe. And it's quite clear that we are in a crisis. I think, this morning was really concerning, and not because I disagree with any of the facts, but I think the question is about how we respond. And my deep concern after hearing the amount of stress of the morning, which is, again, understandable and acceptable, is that we are headed down a path that makes this problem much, much worse, that does not make it better, that in fact makes kids worse, makes workers less safe, and that costs us more and more and more money. And I'll say more about that in a moment. Our office, one of our core functions, and we are just getting going, and you're looking at 100% of the employees here, so we have a lot on our hands. Our primary function is to really sit with these young people. And we've traveled all over. We've been to We've been to the emergency department and to the psychiatric unit. We've been to residential treatment facilities. We've been to some of these temporary spaces. We looked at the Middlesex facility, which is not in good shape, I will tell you. And secondarily, to bring policy insight to rooms like this. And you know, as Raise the Age and so many other initiatives, you know, point out, we need to be focused on brain science, on best practices, on what we already know about kids. And I think what was missing, what has been missing from this conversation so far, is kind of looking at this from the eyes of a child outward. You know, we heard earlier about children being more often victims, right? And we, in our letter, which I hope to read in a moment, we have some citations about, you know, youth that do offend, and they certainly do, are often have been victims previously. Youth who are in the dependency system, who are in foster care, are much more likely to fall into the juvenile justice system. There's obvious correlations with mental health and, you know, and lack of treatment into offense. What we know is that, you know, it's important not to remove the adults from this equation, in the sense that, as our previous witness said, when we're doing our job poorly, we are setting up kids to fail, right? We are providing services that are inadequate. We are putting them in places that takes away their autonomy and their self-expression. And then, you know, if you think of yourself having to exist in a place without contact with peers, without education, without healthcare, without treatment, that brings out the worst in any human being, right? And so it's not to say that you know, kids don't offend, right? And it's not to blame the adults. It's to think about this systemically. When we invest in an emergency system, what we continue to have is an emergency system, right? We need these emergency placements that are being talked about. We certainly do. But we also need to do the long-term investment in some of the public health, the prevention, the support and the treatment, and more about that in a moment. And I think that, you know, having a plan and concurrent planning, Ms. Casanova used this morning, which I think is an interesting metaphor. We need to have a long-term plan, and we need to have a vision of success, right? What I'm hearing now is urgency, frankly, panic. And that, again, that's justified. But I just want to label that, because we're not going to create good policy if that's where we dwell, right? And I know some of you are thinking this sounds expensive, right? So we are getting to that. So, you know, what's the concurrent planning? It's investing in what we already know works, right? We heard this morning about a program that works well. What are they doing? Let's bolster that. Let's think about replicating that. Lauren has a lot of insight into these systems, has seen them firsthand, and can say more about that. We need to also take a look at, you know, at the needs of our kids, right? And to think about what we can do to, you know, there's two ways of remedying a need for beds. There's making more beds, and then there's ensuring that we actually do need more beds. In other words, if we can invest in prevention, if we can get the kids home early, or keep them in their homes, not remove them in the first place, if they can stay in their homes, that also creates a bed, right? Because we don't need it, right? And I think it's harder to think in that sense. And I think, you know, when you hear about these, you know, these kids who really are in an emergency state, it's hard to envision keeping a kid in their home. But many children in the system, you know, we have like 1,800 kids who have a high level of DCF involvement, between in custody, between on a CCO, on a conditional custody order home, or receiving services because it's been determined that there's a high risk of maltreatment in that home. The vast majority of those kids can potentially, you know, we can work on the bulk of those kids to try to keep them where they are. So I also just wanted to say very quickly about what it's like, what this staffing, this word staffing is a little bit, frankly, Orwellian. I mean, I understand why it's used. And again, this is not to cast blame on DCF at all, because I think the commissioner, the deputy commissioner, Radke, Brenda Gooley, Tyler Allen, all of the folks at DCF really are our partners. And, you know, folks have been concerned that we would be adversarial, that we would be oversight, that we would be, you know, trying to make them look bad, but we really see ourselves as partners. And that is a very true statement. What staffing is, I saw yesterday. So what I saw yesterday was a kid who had been there for up to 2 weeks, according to the folks there, who was receiving no education, who had no peer contact at all. Zero, not even from afar, not able to sit with their peers, had 3 adults sitting with them at all times, was receiving no treatment and was watching TV. It seemed all day. I mean, I walked in and I was there for 45 minutes. And what that is to me is essentially warehousing the youth, right? It's keeping them safe. It's keeping the staff safe, safer, right? But everyone agrees that that's not okay. And we can't do that, right? And it's not even safe for the workers, right? And it's 24/7, the shifts. I wrote down the shifts, but it's round the clock workers tag teaming, as they said this morning, taking them off other cases. It's really treating kids as objects. That makes kids worse. That makes this problem worse. It does not make it better, right? So we need investment in temporary facilities, absolutely, but we also need another plan and we need leadership on that. So we will offer our services to our maximum extent possible. We want to partner with not just DCF, but AHS. I want to get to this letter in a second if we have time, and I want to give Lauren a chance to weigh in. But in terms of the money side of this, I just want to make it clear, the system we have right now is much more expensive than a better one. And the problem is that there's this, the crisis thinking means that we say we don't have money to fix the system. But you see the contradiction there. We're saying we can afford to have this system that doesn't serve anybody, but we can't afford a better one, right? Something's got to give, right? And especially when there's kids at the heart of that, and again, and workers. But these are kids that largely that the state is raising and the state is the legal parent, right? So that puts an extra burden on us, not just DCF, right? On all of us to do better. So, we have to interrupt this cycle and we have to treat this as a systemic issue. And you can hear the concern in my voice and this morning was really, Lauren's been in the system for longer and I think sometimes she laughs at me, at my naivete, but frankly, it was shocking to hear how bad it's gotten. And again, not because I don't believe folks, but because I do. So, we are going to continue to talk to kids and to our partners, and we are going to continue to provide information to you all. We have a report, statutorily mandated report on December 1st that we are fighting to carve out time to write, but we are looking forward to that. We've also been in hotels, I should say, too. That's a whole other thing, rabbit hole to dive down. But I want to give Lauren a chance to speak, and if there are any questions, and I want to get to our letter if there's also time. So
Can we do the letter?
thank
And then I
you.
can speak?
Sure. Are there any questions while I pull up our letter?
And we do have the letter on our committee page.
Okay, I would like to read it into the record if that's okay.
It's already in the record,
Yeah, I'm just.
It's already-
He needs to read.
right? It's already
Okay,
been
so
posted.
if I may highlight a couple of things.
Yeah,
from the letter.
I think that would
That'd be helpful.
So one key point that I think is missing from the DCF report is it's a lot of, for lack of a better term, supply side, right? It's a lot of what our system looked like before the pandemic and what it looks like now and the difference, right? And that gets the gaps for sure. I think what is missing, and you'll notice the data portion is very thin. What's missing is really an understanding of the needs of youth, right? And specifically, right? We heard a lot of folks talk about how this is, the public health angle, even law enforcement, right? To their immense credit, we've made so much progress in understanding, how mental health plays into this. But I don't see, the kids are always shifting, absolutely. But I think a general sense for what the treatment needs are and how they would play out in any future system, right? This generalized therapeutic treatment is sort of a proxy for not great, right? I mean, it's not really evidence-based. And so, it's not that DCF doesn't have this. It's just that I don't think it was, I think if we're considering a treatment system, we have to fit the treatment system to the youth needs, not the other way around, right? Which is kind of what we have right now. Second, I think, a key part of that is The terminology they use is very confusing. And, we have in our letter about licensing, we think it essentially breaks down into RTPs, and Lauren has done a lot of licensing. Residential treatment programs, psychiatric residential treatment facilities, PRTFs, and then unlicensed levels of care. And so, when you think about Woodside and when you think about what went wrong there, obviously this, who was in charge, who was regulating, who had oversight, it's a huge issue. So the terminology, I think, needs to improve. Maybe the biggest thing is FFPSA, and this is on the money side. So FFPSA is the Family First Prevention Services Act, which is a federal statute that was ratified in 2018 that amended Title 40 of the Social Security Act, which is the primary funder of child welfare money coming to states. Most of the money that funds DCF is Title 40 money. FFPSA basically made a change whereby federal money could flow in for prevention instead of simply once kids came into the system. Because it obviously makes sense. Prior to that, you could only get federal Title 40 money if a child had already come into foster care. And of course, it's much more sense to prevent that child from coming into care. So that was a big change. As with federal mandates, as everyone in this room knows, it comes with a couple of rules, right? There's some regulations, some rules. There's a lot of hoops one has to jump through. Vermont has only implemented FFPSA in very limited ways. And, the too long didn't read is we are sitting on millions of federal dollars that we could be pulling into the state. It does require an upfront investment in terms of revamping our systems. It does require state matching funds. But right now, what we're doing is relying on the general fund essentially to fund all of the system that you just heard hours of testimony isn't working, right? And so it just seems, if there are barriers to DCF and AHS implementing FFPSA, we want to hear about them, and we think you all want to hear about them too. FFPSA is an uncapped entitlement, essentially. So, where we have caps on Medicaid, where we have, bottom lines in terms of the general fund, those do not apply in the same way to FFPSA. Our data system, the DCF data system, is a whole other topic, but that's a huge barrier here. And that's something we're going to be talking about in other settings. And so, in terms of the actual facilities that are being made, it seems like DCF is committed to the principles, to, light coming into rooms, to, providing kids maximum time outside. We looked at the Middlesex facility, and, a lot depends on how it's constructed. It's got a long way to go, I want to emphasize, and I would recommend right up the road, easy on, easy off. There's a lot of work that needs to be done there to make it safe for folks. And so, there are things that we can do. Other states also have brought in, national partners to do a limited case study of some of the kids who qualify for residential treatment level of care and assess if there's alternatives to that sort of a placement. And there are best practices, and there is insight into this. So I think I'll leave it there, and Lauren, if you wanted to add, thank you.
Sure. I'd say as a social worker, I'm always trained to see who's not in the room. What's not being said, how, as an investigator, how are we reading between the lines? And I think what is glaring here, if we are truly in an all hands on deck situation, I need to see all of the AHS here, all of the Agency of Human Services. I think what's important to note in DCF's existing system of care, the numbers here, these don't always represent DCF kids. These are also DMH placed kids. And when we're sharing these numbers, I want to see all department involvement here. And I want to hear their perspective, barriers to provide DMH beds, Dale beds, like the entire scope of our Agency of Human Services system of care. Because having only DCF here is reinforcing what the workers are feeling, that they're alone in the field. And I've felt that loneliness. And so I want to highlight that. I think Matthew spoke well about the generalized programming. I want to balance out, with being responsive to the needs of children and youth in the placements, but I'm not convinced that we have a clinical presentation of the youth we are going to be serving in the facilities that we need right now, right? We're in crisis mode and we need a higher level of care. What does that mean? Why, right? Like if they're showing aggression, I frequently have run into, some wonderful debates in how the state of Vermont conceptualizes mental health for children. And we categorize them as mental health kids or behavioral kids, when what I know is every diagnosis is in the DSM. They're the same kid needing that assessment to determine that individual need. Additionally, when we talk about generalized programming, I am very, very worried that we're mixing children that need residential placement or are CHINS kids versus juvenile justice kids versus raise the age kids. So I want to caution, we can't have a 10-year-old placed with a 19 raise the age kid. And I'm not saying DCF would make that type of placement decision, but I want us to be aware of that potentiality, right? And then I think we should also dive in to that data. I know we're going to have the data in December. I just want to highlight that. I'm also excited by who already here today has provided data, but then how often did we hear, I don't have that data? And we have to right size the system of care based on numbers and based on clinical presentation. And I'd caution when we talk about alternative settings, when that phrase is used, that usually means unlicensed settings. And so if we've heard DCF is committed to oversight, accountability, and transparency, where is that if it's an unlicensed setting? And lastly, we heard, because I love that Commissioner Winters talked about the elephant in the room, and I've been to the elephant many times. What Steve Howard testified to, Mr. Campbell mentioned earlier too, when Mr. Campbell said, we're going to have a tragedy happen, and we'll say or ask, how did this happen? We always look at this. We haven't, right? So Steve Howard mentioned tragedies that have happened, but Woodside was a tragedy and the state has not reviewed what happened there. And I know there was a big story that just happened, and that is only the surface. And so I am not confident in the state's ability to move forward until we look back.
So I appreciate both your testimony. I'd like to open it up for questions for the committee. Teresa?
The first thing I have to say is thank you, because I thought it's, I must be really thick because I don't really get these different levels of care. They've been referenced like a dozen different times in a dozen different ways. And I just read them and I think this all sounds the same to me. So I appreciate knowing that, maybe it wasn't just me in looking at that. And the other thing I appreciate is that, what you're talking about is really looking at it from the kids' needs perspective, and starting with that. And I really do feel like we're in that sort of crisis panic mode, and usually good decisions are not usually made in that kind of mode, especially ones that are sort of far reaching and long lasting. And these have the potential to be that. So I get the sort of need for something immediate, to sort of stop the burning, if you will. But But I really do caution all of us, here to look at a long-term system that is more reflective of the national research of best practices. We haven't heard about what therapeutic means here. There's like terms being thrown around, but, I guess I would say in the opportunity that you've had to visit the situation down at the sheriff's office, which still not crazy about, but there's an opportunity to provide therapeutic services. It's not happening. Or at least it's reported to not be happening.
Oh, no, it's not happening. I'm not sure there's an opportunity in that setting.
Oh,
yes.
Well,
I agree.
the setting, yeah, but I just am, it's not really a question. I guess it's an affirmation of what I'm hearing you say. And it's a caution for us, I think, to make sure that whatever investments that we end up making, that we are really clear about what purpose they're serving and for how long they will serve that purpose. And it's why you heard me ask questions about the psychiatric residential treatment facility this morning. That's being set up as a long-term strategy, and 15 beds. That's pretty significant. So I just, when you said all of AHS should be at the table, I agree. And we haven't even talked about AOE and all of the kids in residential placements being funded by AOE. That some of them have joint work with AHS and some of them do not. And we know precious little about all of that. So I'm just putting out more cautions for us to I guess, not overreact, but to provide the safety that we need to provide both for the staff and for the youth, but to be careful about the long-term systems that we are setting up.
Right. We appreciate that, Teresa. Thank you.
Thank you. It's great to see you both again and to have you here. It's really wonderful to see that the office is a reality. Thanks for the work that you're doing. It's a lot. It's a heavy lift in a short period of time. And I do want to go back to something you were talking about. And so this morning I asked about needs. What are the needs? And you've clarified that a little bit for me through what are the clinical needs and what's the DSM say and what do we do for prevention? So what understanding do you have about the data that we're collecting around those needs, if any? Is that something, how can we look for that? How can we find that out? Because everything we're doing is predicated on a perception of need. And so I won't go into the AOE, but I do know that there are great CSAC people working in our schools and they're doing a lot of super counseling, and some of those kids are just as difficult as the justice involved, or there could be justice involved. But what suggestions do you have to accomplish some of the goals that you talked about so that we can merge what we're planning on doing over here with what we're actually seeing in the community in terms of clinical needs?
Those are very good questions. I think just a couple of quick bullets, and I'm sure Lauren has insight here too. Number one, I will go back to the DCF data system. They don't really, the data system is like a, microcosm of the bigger crisis. It's 1983. You all probably have heard about it before. We're going to be doing more about it. It's non-functional. Okay. So it's not good data. Yes, some of it is reliable. I'm not saying it's all unreliable, but in terms of a tool to use to do policy, impossible. It doesn't function for the day-to-day, just very basics. So I don't want to sound negative, but I honestly don't think that's a controversial statement. I think DCF would agree with that.
Right.
Yeah. So we've heard that from, not in that language, but from them repeatedly. Number two, I think, qualitative data is as important as quantitative. They're both important. We heard some today about, violence of youth. I accidentally skipped over this in my letter. but I think youth voice is very important. And I think in Vermont, we are big on confidentiality and I deeply respect that. In another state I worked in, they weren't as good at that and folks suffered. Confidentiality is important, but I do think that there is a place for youth voice at this table. And I think folks like, Jesse, I'm skipping the name, Jesse Wine, YDP, the youth development program could support that. And we would be happy to sort of, help folks, the voice get to you, but I think you all also, I would urge you to carve out the space. You all, I cannot, tell you what to do, of course. Third, the Office of Racial Justice Statistics is a new entity that's part of the Office of Racial Equity, Susanna Davis's organization or office. The Office of Racial Justice Statistics is new and is coming online now. They're even newer than us, and I think they will have some good insight into this. The RDAP, who I think you're going to hear from next, has a lot of insight. We attend those meetings as well. I think like looking through the eyes of Black and brown Vermonters it's even though their numbers are small, they have the roughest ride, right? For a bunch of systemic reasons. Nobody is trying to discriminate against them. But I think that looking out from those eyes outward help you understand kind of some of the bigger picture, and our racial justice statistics, one of which is cited in our letter, are not great, even though our numbers are very small. Those are just a couple of things I would say. I think there are some, I think data is important. And I think, like, to go back to DCF, I think it goes back to what are the licensing requirements of each of these placements? What are the needs of the kids? There is some data there. And I just want to correct myself earlier. I didn't mean to make it sound like none of DCF's data is true. So I think asking DCF what reliable data they have is a good idea as well, because they would know. So, and I think lastly, the family services part of this, the foster care part of this is intimately important, as are those other floating entities, education, et cetera. And, restraint and seclusion is another interesting sort of thing that crosses these, because the regs for PRTFs, the regs for residential treatment programs, thank you, and the education regs are all different. And part of our statute is mandatory reports to us from DCF about restraints and seclusions of children in DCF custody. And I'll just say that's been a struggle for them because of the data system. So that's an example of how it doesn't really work that well. They have had to spend, again, countless hours putting together that data because they can't run simple reports. And they don't have, it's very challenging to create a new data flow for something like get all the data of restraints and seclusions from workers to the administrators at family services and get those to us, right? And they're now required by statute to do this. This is not, it's outside of our hand. We're supposed to be doing that. And I'll just say that's been a struggle so far. So
I think using structures we already have in place, with the case review committee that is statewide and has statewide partners, we can use that tool to see the analysis of need for residential placements. And then also with our existing statute, we're accepting complaints, which I like to call referrals, because complaints just, starts us on the bed. And really what we've seen are the youth who are falling through the cracks, where there really is no next step for them, or there are no providers for their entire clinical presentation. And so with the complaints, with the CRC process, it would be interesting if we could have a deep dive into certain case studies and see what that results as a starting point for the data as we gather more data points. And then I know that our residential providers that exist in the state are keeping their own data, and it's good data. It's better than the state data. And I think there's opportunity to partner with them to see what the true needs are for the youth and children in the system of care. And lastly, I just wanted to highlight, since I've noted the partners and the residential providers, it's on my to-do list, but I'm really concerned and worried that there have been many RFPs unanswered. And I think that is a point that we can not understate. And I'm not going to speculate to why until I talk to them.
So just one quick follow-up. So as you're talking through some of this, your office can be very powerful in bringing folks together to identify some of that information.
We see ourselves as a convener.
Somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, we have hopes and dreams. We I don't want to put my hand out right now. I'll save that for later. But I mean, we don't have a website yet, but we are overwhelmed already. And so we've become in some ways like a lot of other agencies with overwhelming need. So we're trying to carve out the space to do this just like everybody else is. We would like to convene a conference, every year, like other states do, where thought leaders come together, right? And I think we can do that. But I know we're short on time, so I'll save this for later. So.
And we're getting short on time here too as well.
Oh, that's what I mean.
Yeah, well,
Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm sure you're going to be coming before different legislative committees as the session ramps up here. So
We would be happy to. Thank you for the time. We really appreciate it.
and we're going to move right along here because I know we have some folks that keep close to their clock. And we need to take a vote, and I don't want to lose the quorum because we may have some issues with the quorum. So we have Eton here that's going to be just giving us a quick update in terms of our DAP. And Eton, welcome. Welcome. And if you could identify yourself for the record, and I'm going to lean a little bit to Senator Sears and Representative Lalonde in terms of some of this testimony to help us out with. So welcome, Eton, if you could introduce yourself for the record.
Good afternoon. I am Dr. Etan Nasreddin Longo, and I am chair of the Racial Disparities Advisory Panel. I'm here today just to give you an update on our work. And let me also say, I can strike one part of this. The ask for a different due date, an extension, as it were, I would like to withdraw. For some reason, we put our first report in on the 4th of December. And so it stuck in my head that the due date was the 1st of December. I went back to the statute, what a shocking thing to do, and noticed that the due date is in fact the 15th of January. So just pretend I never asked.
That's an easy one.
Wasn't that wonderful? I know. So, a bit of background. The RDAP was created by Act 54 of 2017. We are statutorily required to provide biennial reports on any sense we have, data that we have that points to racial disparities in both the criminal and juvenile justice systems. The report of 2019, we submitted it, as I say, in December. I have no idea why we did that. We decided after the submission of that report to dedicate ourselves to protecting that work product. And to that end, in the report that is coming out this year in 2023, but January 15th of 2024, it's a strange 2023. We will provide an overview of the 2019 report with an eye towards what happened with the recommendations made in that report, what seems to be in process, and what has perhaps not made the cut yet, as it were. And that will be just part of this report. As I say, we're protecting the work product. We were asked, if you go back to the statute, and I'll just give you a little background here, there were three main questions that the panel was asked to consider. The first was how to institute a public complaint process to address perceived implicit bias across all systems of state government. We made a number of recommendations, including beefing up the Human Rights Commission, which we identified as being the appropriate organ for this particular task. We need to get in touch with them. I have not yet done that. Why? I don't know why. I'm busy. I will get in touch with them. That's on my list for next week. I have understood, however, even though Boryang is gone, that they are still feeling inadequately staffed for that particular task, the task that the RDAP was proposing. Secondly, we were asked whether and how to prohibit racial profiling, including implementing any associated penalties. We had a long list of recommendations, increasing cultural competency for law enforcement officers, things of that nature, ensuring that Vermont statutes track with existing federal requirements with respect to due process for those with limited English proficiency. And I know a lot of work has been done on this, particularly by the Office of Racial Equity, and a lot of the rest of us sort of participated in that. The panel did not adequately discuss associated penalties. And we wrote in the report that we will discuss this issue and present proposals in the future. Whether or not that will happen with this particular document, I'm not certain. It may be that that comes up separately. It was clear when it was brought up before the 2019 report, that was going to be a pretty contentious issue with this body. So we just shelved it because we knew we could spend all of our time on it, and we didn't want to. The last question was whether to expand law enforcement race data collection practices to include data on non-traffic stops by law enforcement. We spent a great deal of time on that issue. We believe that data collection is a vital issue, one that needs to be addressed early. This is all words from 2019. One that needs to be addressed early as we grapple with the challenges and the injustice represented by racial disparities. That is underway. There is the work group on S250 from last session. I sit on that as well. And that work is going. We have not considered as a panel whether that work really fulfills what our vision was at that point. We'll get there. That's in process. The key issue, I'd say, that caught the legislature's attention from the 2019 report, as you likely know, was about data collection. This led to two subsequent reports. They were asked for in 2020 and in 2021. This accounts for why there are more than 2 years between the 2019 biennial report and the 2023 report, because we wrote two in the middle there. That work was performed with the Crime Research Group, several people from UVM, and it produced in the end the Division of Racial Justice Statistics, which is in the Office of Racial Equity. The staffing of that body continues. 2 people have already been hired and are at work, Tiffany North Reed and Laura Carter. The rather obscenely extensive but entirely necessary advisory board that should work with that division has not yet been staffed. And my sense is once this report is done, we will have time to help ORE with that. You should know, if you don't, that Executive Director Davis sits on the RDAP as well. The DRJS, I love acronyms, are working on compiling data that are needed for H270, which is that large cannabis bill from last session. It's a difficult task. The legislature perhaps did not anticipate that, There are some data there that are needed, and some data are simply not available. The report will be as informative and as fulsome as possible, but the creation of the needed data that's required in that bill is beyond the scope, I believe, of either the DRJS or the RDAP. There's a certain level of expertise there none of us actually have. Other recommendations were made in the 2019 report, and some were not consensus recommendations. That was an interesting part of that report. Almost everybody agreed on everything. We'll be reviewing those for the present report as we continue to feel that the legislature would benefit from a resume of the thinking of the RDAP as a whole. So that will be there. Of course, there are also new issues. Much work is being done on these. We've split into subcommittees that meet on their own, separate from the entire panel. We have been looking at the so-called second look legislation. Absolutely fits our mandate. There are data to show that there are racial disparities in different areas of an encounter with the law enforcement, with the criminal justice system, moving from law enforcement through incarceration. And so given that there are data that suggest racial disparities, we must look at it. That's our job. So we will be doing that. There will be a variety of recommendations from the juvenile justice system, helped by both Tyler Allen, who sits on the panel, and Elizabeth Morris, who is kind of his second in a way. We felt that we did not adequately cover the juvenile justice system in the first report. We're hoping to make up for that. There will also be some recommendations concerning the community safety reports that have sort of proliferated in the state since the summer of 2020 and the death of George Floyd. They will be recommendations concerning their usefulness, I understand, and the ways in which lawmakers can assist with their creation. Let me just look and make sure I've covered everything here. I'm trying to keep with your time. I have. Now, lastly, money. We get it. Nobody has any. There's never any. I just listened to your last last witness and money. The question continues to be how important it is for the state to reduce or indeed erase, when and where possible, racial disparities. I cannot answer this question for you, nor can the RDAP as a whole. We can only give you the information that we cull and process. That there continue to be problems would, I hope, be evident to everyone. I gave testimony 2 years ago that was very focused upon how much slavery cost in roughly 1850s, so in the middle of the 19th century. I will not repeat that testimony now, but I will condense it because I think that it helps clarify the matters at hand. Hold on with this one. It's the professor moment. Slaves cost between $200,000 and $400,000 apiece. Many of the larger plantations had around 150 slaves, so the costs are between $30 million and $60 million. These are in 19th century dollars here. There's no real need to move beyond these simple figures. It's simply, I'm pointing out the enormous sums that white supremacy commanded in the mid-19th century. It makes clear certainly why the South never has quite recovered from the economic blow that was the Civil War. A typical laborer in the 19th century, in the middle of the 19th century, and that was a very common job description, as much as job descriptions existed, made about $800 a year. So you have a sense of how expensive white supremacy was to maintain. To erase it, which is the project that the RDAP is involved in, and I believe the legislature is too, given the financial outlay that was required to run it, will require money. I know there has been scuttlebutt, people feeling that money has already been put towards this initiative. Oh my God, they always come with their hands out. It's true, because free is not an option for erasing white supremacist issues. It didn't get here without the expense of an enormous amount of money. You will, as you well know, have to balance financial exigencies with a desire to do what is morally right after 4+ centuries of white supremacy. It would be interesting to know how much white supremacy presently costs, separate from the monies that are spent to eradicate it. I don't have these data, but think of the time spent in debating these issues in the legislature. How many people? How much do they make an hour? How long is this debated? I think it's easy to see that the dollars do in fact add up. So spending so as to finish wasteful and immoral spending on disparate treatment is likely, possibly, a cost savings. We'll have to defer to the Division of Racial Justice Statistics to answer that one way or the other. But it is also a soul-saving measure as well. The last issue that I'd like to address is the purview of the RDAP, and that is probably a question that we will take up again after this report is complete. People have come to us with questions around education, around housing. Now, of course, these are tangential in many respects to issues of racial disparities in the criminal and juvenile justice systems. However, the statute asks us to consider the criminal justice system, the adult criminal justice system, and the juvenile justice system. That's it. But people keep coming to us with things that I know would excite the RDAP, certainly something they would want to look at. The problem is there would need to be a statutory change that would involve the Attorney General's office, since we are under their auspices. There would have to be not so much a change in the staffing of the RDAP itself, but rather in how often it meets, how that is recompensed for the community members who are on the panel. There is more work to do, shall we say, in addressing racial disparities across state government as a whole than the RDAP, as it is presently practiced and constituted, can handle. The question will become, if the RDAP is to be the body that looks at this work, there will need to be several changes, as I've just outlined. And that's pretty much all I have to give to you. I hope I brought that in. I did. Good.
Yeah, thank you. Thank
You're
you. So I'm gonna open it up for any questions, comments. Sure. We've got the two chairs of the judiciary committees here, and I'm sure that they're gonna take some of what you've just recommended. We've got a legislative session coming up in 2 months. So sure that they're gonna, 2 months,
No,
almost
we've
2 months.
Well, almost.
Almost 2 months, 2 months and a few days.
I
Senator
appreciate
Sears, don't make it more painful.
Feels it. Thank you. No, thank you. That was pretty thorough and very well done.
Thank you.
And I look forward to working with you. I'd like to know more about your plan to expand, because I expand the scope beyond the juvenile and adult justice system, because certainly I think it's important, and so feel free to be in touch.
Will do. It's good to see you, sir.
Good to see you.
Thank you, Akon.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
That's great. Thank you.
Absolutely. Good luck with the rest of your afternoon then.
Yes, yes, thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
So Ben, why don't you come on up while we still have a quorum in the room? We're gonna need, if we're gonna take a couple minutes here.
Right. Good afternoon, everybody.
Do you have the documents on our webpage?
And I'll also share my screen.
Dick, yeah?
Yeah, we're able to vote, am I correct?
Well, Ben's gonna go over that with you.
Yeah, so quickly,
But it's gonna count.
yeah, so, and to revise a little bit what I discussed with you, Representative Evans. So anybody is allowed to vote remotely up to 3 times for any reason, upon proper notice to the chair. So from my understanding.
3 times, 3 meetings. Is it 3 meetings or 3 times?
It's 3 days.
3 days,
In
okay.
the joint resolution.
All right,
So,
3 days.
So
yes.
if you're sitting on other summer study committees,
Upon
And you
notice to
get-
the chair?
Yeah, well, and this resolution only applies to joint committees as well.
okay, so if they're sitting on any other joint committee beyond this one, and then they happen to be on video and there's a vote in that joint committee, that would count towards those 3 votes. Is that correct?
Well, it depends if those meetings were on the same day.
Well, then it gets real complicated.
Yeah. So the bottom line, one thing.
Language.
The one thing I just wanted to flag right is just in the way, for on up to 3 different days until January 5th. So if you had multiple joint meetings on the same day, it would all just count as one day. But if you had joint meetings on 3 different days, and you took votes on those 3 days, that would count towards your limit. So I just wanted to flag that for those of you that are remote today, that when you're faced with the vote on these letters, it will just count as one day. So whether you decide to use up one of your days is your decision, but I wanted to flag that for you all.
But there wouldn't be 2 votes in that, we'd
I
have to
thought there
vote
was a-
on 2 separate things.
I thought there was a provision that allowed you to vote. I voted in 2 meetings of the joint fiscal committee, I believe. And I had to meet remotely because they started at 9:00. And you can't get there from here. So
Yeah, and I think it
this
just,
would be my
so,
3rd meeting.
and I'm rereading the resolution now. Through Friday, January 5th, 2024, each member of a joint committee is authorized to vote remotely in that committee. If the member is tested positive for COVID-19 and is required within the isolation period, and for not more than 3 days for any other reason, such that the committee chair or co-chairs are notified.
So in that committee, that means 3 times each joint committee that you.
Yes. So I think that makes it a little bit cleaner and probably offers a little bit more protection in other
Yeah.
instances.
We didn't vote at all the last time the Joint Justice Oversight Committee met.
No. So you would have,
Well, I was here.
you are
so it
here.
doesn't-
So we would have 3 votes remotely
3 days.
for this committee.
Yes, 3 days remotely in this committee.
Oh.
So if you took multiple votes on one day, it would just count as the one day.
And
For this committee.
we only have 2 more meetings left. So the 3 of you on Zoom would be able to vote today if you want to use up one of your days.
Unless,
This committee.
unless there was, because I do know prior to last meeting, there were a couple members that were remote, but I cannot recall whether votes were taken on those days.
I don't think we did any
Public
votes.
inebriates,
Hmm?
the public inebriates letter we voted on, right, at our very first meeting?
When did we do the?
No, we didn't. No, it was discussed the first meeting
Yeah.
and it was just an email that was sent to,
Oh, we didn't vote on
Yeah, it
it?
was
Okay.
just an email.
yeah.
So the 3 of you remotely will have to decide if you want to use up a vote for this
I
committee
used one of mine.
today. But I don't think we're going to have very many. We've got 2 more meetings.
Right, so that would be 3.
So you should be okay to vote today. And that leaves you 2 more votes for our 2 next meetings.
Yeah.
That works. So let's go, Ben, so we can go home.
You want me to share my screen with the?
Deer camp. So deer camp is probably more important.
Okay, so this letter is the Act 28 competency examinations recommendations from that were discussed in previous meetings. The bulk of the recommendations are as follows, and this is no different than what was sent out, I believe it was last week. So the first recommendation is to lift the July 1st, 2024 repeal. That would repeal psychologists trained in forensic psychology to continue to perform competency evaluations. So that would keep that in place. Amend 13 VSA 4816E to ensure that competency examination reports by those psychologists are considered admissible evidence and conclusive on the issue. And this keeps them on the same level as psychiatrists. And this recommendation came from the Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs that noticed that this was missed last year. And so there was a gray area for them. So that's why it's included now. The third recommendation, to review whether psychologists trained in forensic psychology need any additional certifications to perform the examinations, to examine any pitfalls in scheduling court-ordered competency examinations, and whether a lack of available professionals contributes to court schedule backlogs and other case delays. And finally, to explore whether an oversight mechanism should be created to audit or otherwise assess all competency examinations that are performed.
That's what we worked up last committee meeting. And it got sent out to both Senator Sears and myself for review. Any discussion? Jane?
I move that we send the letter off to committees of jurisdiction as written.
It's been moved. We need a second. Do we have a second? Martin seconds it. It's been moved and seconded that we send this letter off to the appropriate committees for their review and encouragement to look at during this upcoming session. Any further discussion?
Just quickly, so the only thing we're voting on is simply to send this as is to those committees of jurisdiction.
Part of our recommendations. Any other questions? We need to do a roll call on this, or just all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Pass unanimously.
I think
Yeah, I said I just didn't unmute in time.
Pardon?
I think if it's on the phone, you have to do a roll call, but because we have Zoom. we can-
Right, and they have to identify themselves if they're on the phone, right? 9, 0, 1. 1 absent. 9, 0, 1.
Who's not here?
Trevor, score. So score.
Okay, so if there's no other remaining issue on this letter, we'll move to the next one. And these are the healthcare, the memo concerning healthcare in Vermont's correctional facilities. And again, this was sent out as well. And this essentially just explains what the committee has done in taking testimony this off session from DOC, WellPath, including the prospective 5-year cost estimate of a state-run healthcare system in lieu of the current system. And then concluding that as a result of the testimony and presentations, this committee requests that the committees of jurisdiction engage in a holistic review of the state's correctional healthcare system with a particular focus on the scope and cost of the mental health and substance use and abuse services that are provided to persons receiving those services in Vermont's correctional facilities.
So also to let members know, if you look on our webpage, there was some documents that were submitted by some folks about the healthcare. Jennifer Camfield, Leslie Thornson, and Meg Murphy have submitted letters. Documents surrounding the healthcare. And I know we don't have the time to go into depth with those today, and they were aware of that as well. Peggy? Teresa?
I just have a question. I don't have any problem with the memo, but it feels a little bit like a revolving door. So the committees send it to us and then we send it back to the committee. You know, we take testimony. They send it to us because they think that we're going to have more time to take testimony that they've run out of. And then we send it back to them to do the very same thing. So, I mean, I'm sure it's not, you know, I'm sure that's obvious to everybody sitting around the table, but it doesn't seem to solve anything, I guess is my point.
We should get an outside task force to extend the circular motion of it. Of course, it doesn't have.
They have a three-way, you know, instead of just one way.
We're gonna let the House handle this and the Senate's gonna wait and see.
The Senate's gonna do the competency thing first, and also do the healthcare thing first.
No, you know, we've been looking at
I
this
hope you're
now.
not right about
Sorry. Can I just, I was gonna say, we've been looking at this issue now for quite a bit of time, and we did have that report a few years ago indicating that we were the highest cost healthcare, one of the highest cost in the country. And then we started thinking about how can we extend some kind of Medicaid coverage and how can we improve our substance use disorder, mental health services. So it hasn't ever been fully embedded in healthcare committees.
No.
And human services committee. So maybe this will be an opportunity to have those House and Senate committees have a hearing or a meeting together to try and get at this a little bit. It is frustrating. I agree with Representative Wood. It feels like the revolving door, but maybe some of us will dive into it a little bit more. It could be a good thing to do.
I think you hit on an extremely important point, Senator Lyons, and that is the Medicaid, use of Medicaid to help, and particularly when people are leaving corrections, to go back into the community. This is one of the places where we've had, I think, many problems. And as you know, many of them end up back in jail after they leave, unfortunately. So I think that's really to have that continuum. Also, as we continue to hear horror stories about some of the problems with the well path, or well, before that, whoever it was, I think that's important that we can keep an eye on that and keep looking at that problem, the healthcare system. And also, and Senator or Representative Emmons knows, one of our challenges is the aging inmate population.
And the mental health population.
Well, but particularly the aging population is no longer, many of those individuals are no longer a danger to anyone. They, you know, they're in walkers or wheelchairs, et cetera, and they're no longer a danger, but there's no place for them. And I think one of the saddest things we heard was testimony about somebody who was in hospice care dying in a prison because there was no place else for him to go.
Good. Good. So I'll entertain a motion to move this memo off to our respective committees.
Madam Chair, this is Topper. I'll make that motion.
Okay, so Topper made the motion. Bob, you want to?
I'll second that.
Yes. Any further discussion? If not, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? It's carried 901. Yes, Martin.
Very quickly, the first two items on that earlier list of recommendations, I'm going to be sending those to Eric Fitzpatrick to put into the miscellaneous judiciary bill, which the House starts with this year. And I'll leave the other three to somebody else to.
So which ones, what are you talking about?
The lift the July 1st, 2024 repeal.
You're back to the competence.
You're doing the sunset.
Yeah, I'm getting rid of.
You're doing all the easy stuff. Okay,
That's what the miscellaneous bill's for.
Yeah, we have, I mean, miscellaneous judiciary bill, probably were those two.
Yeah, thank you.
Just wanted to, like, no.
Saves us.
So next, we have anything else?
Move to adjourn.
Not quite.
I'm going to suggest we hold off on the juvenile justice system till next meeting. which
Who
we
knew
had
that was
quite a
gonna
bit of
happen?
discussion today.
Yeah.
But I'd like to know, Ben, are there any restrictions on us in any, we were offered an opportunity to meet with DCF, go to talk to kids, blah, blah, blah. I'm wondering what the restrictions are, given the confidential nature of juvenile justice.
Yeah, that's.
Yeah, I mean, off the top of my head, the only restriction that I could recall is that this committee is limited, at least as far as per diem payments, meet up to 6 times. And if there's a quorum of members and go on a trip somewhere, that would constitute meeting, and then there would have to, not only would that affect pay, but that would then potentially require other accommodations for.
There are no confidentiality things.
With the juvenile,
I would have to look into that.
I would think.
I'd imagine that there are restrictions on that side of it, but I couldn't tell you what those are off the top of my head.
At the time we visited Woodside without any issues.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember when we went to Woodside.
Yeah,
But we didn't have, we never had a quorum of one more.
we did. We had a whole committee. Yeah.
Committee went to. So our,
We did, but we didn't go all together. We went 2 different days.
Yeah, I'm just saying our committee went all together.
Yeah.
so our next meeting is Thursday, November 9th.
Right.
And then the meeting after that is December 12th, which is a Tuesday. So. Huh?
Nothing.
It's not going to snow on the 12th of December, by the way.
Or the 9th of November.
Yeah, it's not going to.
We're not even gonna have.
I'm getting my snow tires on the 8th.
So are we